Well, as we listen carefully to today's gospel, we realise that Jesus has had his disagreements with the learned scribes and the Pharisees all along the way to Jerusalem. While the unlearned crowd, you might say, are still enthusiastically behind him, full of zeal, hanging off his words, following him. He speaks to them not to destroy their zeal today, but to temper it with something more characteristic of his opponents. He just doesn't want them following him because they have the warm inner glow. He wants their faith in him to be based on truth, to based on reality. The crowds did not know what this journeying up to Jerusalem meant for Jesus. It just didn't mean going from A to B. The journey to Jerusalem means the journey to the cross. Nor did they know what following after him really meant. So Jesus wants to inform their zeal with a dose of learned realism, warning them that anyone who does not bear the cross and follow after him cannot be his disciples. It's not all beer and skittles, he's saying. It's going to cost to be a follower of mine. Jesus is in some way already bearing his cross as he makes his way to Jerusalem. And he will carry it physically on Good Friday to his place of execution. There, on the cross, he will defeat evil by submitting himself to the worst evil can do and overcoming it. All that and its consequence for those who follow is encapsulated in his words. Whoever does not bear the cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. The mark of the Lord's life is his cross. The mark for us who are his followers must also be the cross. So we too are in conflict with sin, with Christ at our head, and we too may have to bear the brunt of what opposition to our faith can still do. The crowds following Jesus had no idea of anything like this. Supposing that Jesus was going to win a war on behalf of their race, their nation, its structures of family, blood and clan. So in other words, he was going to be the one who would do everything right, the great political leader, they thought. Jesus tells them that if they are to follow him, they must hate their own family. This stark way of speaking, characteristic of Jesus' language and times, hyperbole we call it, tells the crowds that when the time comes to choose, we must put God and his Christ before everything we hold dear, even the very things we expect God and Jesus to preserve. The things closest to us, our family, our very life, our possessions. If it's a choice between these and God, then God must come first. The difference between the relationship between the two would almost mean that we would hate in comparison to the love that we must have for God. And finally, Jesus advises us all to think over the cost of discipleship. If the crowds were actually going to war, the only intelligent thing to do would be to assess the odds of winning before risking everything. Don't start building a tower until you know you can get it finished, that you've got the resources, the money, etc. Or you'll only deserve mockery. The virtue of good thinking must indeed apply to the whole of our faith. So the question is, where do we stand today? We need the zeal of the crowds following our Lord, but we also need the learning of the scribes and the Pharisees, asking their questions and inquiring. We need to have thought over the challenge of discipleship in a time when it is taxing, when we more and more feel a relentless opposition towards our faith and religion, sometimes in the name of science and good thinking, attacks that are more militant, more planned, more zealous, and sometimes they can even seem justified. Just think of this week, headlines this week. Stephen Hawking says, don't need God for creation. Physics can explain it all. So nothing new. So Stephen Hawking hasn't come upon a new argument. Many scientists would argue against him. So it's not a question of science. It's a matter of logic and thinking, and ultimately the gift of faith that tells us that science and religion are not at war with one another. We need to recognise both. Both helps the other. Faith and reason go together, not an either or. It's not an argument just from faith or an argument just from reason. Faith and reason can shed light on each other. The worst thing we can do in a situation of attack like this is to lose our zeal for the gospel of Christ. It might be tempting to carry on our religion in an unintelligent way. Oh, well, I don't care what they say, I just believe. It's not good enough. We could declare that you can argue for the existence of God. We could declare that you can't argue for the existence of God anyway, and therefore treat religion as something only emotional, something about our feelings, separated from thinking and in a world of its own. See religion and science as so far apart that religion can be insulated and protected from science. Even if we could muster up enthusiasm for such a religion, and it wouldn't be worthy of the term, it would be to maintain it without real thinking. Religion and science may be distinct, but it is false to imagine that they have always been or are necessarily in conflict. In fact, our whole scientific tradition in the Western world is the fruit of faith and creation and draws so much from Christian philosophy and theology. The father of modern science, Albert Einstein, would speak about the God behind it all, the mind of God behind creation. Science and religion ultimately belong together peacefully in the same world. So we cannot withdraw from the challenges our culture presents us with today. We cannot withdraw from thinking about faith. Others have shifted our culture against faith. It's not impossible that we too can shift the culture once again by our conviction, our zeal, and our systematic presentation of the truth of our faith, if we are prepared to be both zealous and thoughtful. It means that we must put Christ first, be ready to suffer and to risk defeats, even if we know that the truth will always be ultimately victorious. And Christ will win. He has counted the cost, he has faced our worst enemies and conquered them, so we must not be afraid to share his sufferings, so as to share his victory. But we need to take stock of what we must do and what it might cost, or we shall only deserve to be mocked. If you want to be a follower of mine, take up your cross every day and follow me.